Hi, I'm Chief Donnie Williams with the Wilmington Police Department. This is our first episode of Behind the Badge. As promised, our first episode would focus in on homicide investigations. Located with me is Captain Tilmon, our Criminal Investigations Division Commander. How you doing?
I am doing good, Chief. How are you?
Good, man. Thank you for taking the time out to come sit at the blue table, and we're going to talk about homicide investigations.
Excellent.
So far for the city of Wilmington, we've had 12 murder investigations this year.
Yes.
Your detectives, they're young, they're eager, they're a great bunch of men and women, and we have solved 11 of those crimes.
That is correct.
And I know we have shows like the First 48 that folks look at, and it takes you into what homicide investigations look like in Dallas and different cities throughout the country. But I want folks to see what goes on with the Wilmington Police Department.
Well, the first thing that happens is that patrol responds to an event. Sometimes they could be initiated by our shot spotter system here at the Wilmington Police Department. Sometimes it could just be based on a 911 call that there's been an incident of violence. And the patrol officers will respond to that incident. And once they get there, they'll apprise the situation and try to figure out what we've got going on and the seriousness of the injuries. Of course, if we have serious injuries on any shooting, stabbing, bludgeoning type incident, especially some type of injuries that are potentially life-threatening, even if they're not potentially life-threatening, detectives are summoned. Now, initially, the detective that may respond to the scene may or may not be a homicide detective, but if those detectives get on scene and find that certain criteria are met, then they can initiate the homicide and robbery investigation team, which is currently led by Sergeant Myron Irving. And then Sergeant Irving will bring his team out and they'll begin their process of investigation, which always starts at the initial scene.
Yes, and in addition to our detectives being notified, normally our on-call staff officers notified, the deputy chiefs are notified, the assistant chief is notified, and I'm notified. And I have taken it on as a personal commitment that if we have a homicide in the city of Wilmington and I'm available, I will respond to the scene. But once I get to the scene, I normally don't go into the crime scene. And what's real important is we allow our folks to work. And normally we give them 12 to 15 hours of what we like to call free time, where they can just work their scene. They're not getting any pressure from us to know what's going on. And once we get to that 12 to 14-hour period, they're required to come into the station and we hold a chief's briefing. And that's when they bring me up to speed and the other key players in the organization on what's actually taking place with the case.
That's correct, and that's advantageous for our detectives. You talked about the first 48 earlier. And there's a general, and it's a general rule. The first 48,
right.
It's critical that police gather as much information and evidence as they can within those first 48 hours. Because as time elapses and as time goes by, you begin losing physical evidence, forensic evidence, testimonial evidence, memories begin to fade. So as time elapses, you start losing evidence that's critical to solving your case. So the detectives are on scene and they're trying to size up the scene and what's important and what's not, and making decisions about what items are actual evidence that are pertinent, that need to be photographed, examined, and collected. That's the most important thing the detectives are doing when they first get on scene, and time is of the essence.
And when you say photographing and collecting, who does the actual photographing and collecting?
So at the Wilmington Police Department, we also have a crime scene investigation unit, which is predominantly staffed by non-sworn personnel that are employees of the Wilmington Police Department, and they are expert in forensic evidence collection and photography and crime scene sketches. They do all of that work to assist and aid our detectives in painting the picture, not only about what happened so the detectives can kind of figure out who was where, who was standing where, who was driving where was this car when all this began. We can answer a lot of those questions in a way that in the future, what we're hoping is if we can bring the case to successful prosecution, and we can also paint that picture for the jurors that are going to be seated on this case. And that critical work on these homicide investigations is done by our CSI unit. So it's not just the detectives who are out there. This is a full-on teamwork assignment. In the past, when the detectives were on scene, detectives typically don't have computers in their cars and that kind of stuff. They have smartphones that they can access. But detectives on a scene were really only armed with their notebook and their eyes and their senses. And so the detectives would be gathering all this evidence on the scene, and then they would have to go back to the station and regroup and rethink, and then start running information on victims, witnesses, and potential suspects in our databases. But now at the Wilmington Police Department, since we're talking about teamwork, we can talk about how our STING Center is brought to bear in these criminal investigations. So in the past, when we didn't have the STING Center, the detectives would have to come back to the station and then input all this stuff in the databases to find those answers to start working those investigative leads. Whereas now, while our detectives are on scene with CSI, trying to figure out what evidence we have and kind of try to portray what happened there and developing those investigative theories, the STING Center, we're feeding them information back here at the station. And by the time we regroup to collect our thoughts and try to create, and Sergeant Irving's creating his investigative tasks that need to be accomplished, the STING Center dumps piles of information on us that we would have had to run in the past, but now they've already run it for us while we're out there at the scene, and that really helps expedite that 48-hour window. It gives us a lot more information in a very short period of time, so that Sergeant Irving's team is quickly delegated investigative tasks as soon as they get back to headquarters.
One thing I want to talk about is the family. With these homicide cases, we have a victim and we have family members that we have to deal with. And we have to, in some cases, notify them. And this is the first time that they're hearing that they've lost a loved one. And I've had the misfortune to have to sit in with you on a few of these, which is something that we don't like to do. Let's talk about these and the compassion that our detectives show in dealing with these family members.
Death scenes and then death notifications are one of the most difficult aspects of being a detective. I know on the last death notification that I was involved in, you were there. It was a difficult notification. The victim's family in that instance, he was obviously devastated. He was trying to reach out and help his family member and was trying to help avoid this whole situation, and you and I both knew that going into this notification. And it was a deeply personal notification because here's this guy, I have a brother, and I would be devastated if I lost my brother. And we have to carry that empathy and compassion into these death notifications, because what we're doing is basically telling a family member what our worst nightmare would be, which is to lose a family member to a crime of violence. And that's certainly one of the most difficult endeavors that we take on here at the Wilmington Police Department, and it's got to be done with compassion. And the detectives try to bring as much compassion into those notifications as possible. It's always a difficult task.
It is, and then we have to deal with the family as we go through the process of making the arrest, and as we go through the court system.
And helping the family navigate the victims' witness assistance funds to help them pay for funeral expenses. Our detectives are intimately involved in all that with the victims' families. I think the one thing that it's never fortunate that we have a homicide, but the one positive aspect of these homicides and victims' families is it doesn't matter where a victim's family is from or what race they are or what religion they are. None of that matters. When an investigator solves their loved one's case and helps bring that perpetrator to justice, there is a bond between that investigator and that family that endures forever. We have murder victims' families calling us, giving us all kind of support. The rest of those detectives' careers, we have detectives that have been promoted to sergeant, lieutenant, and so on, but their families from their murder victims still call them to give them information that they become privy to on the streets. So that bond and that relationship that our detectives develop is immeasurable in its value.
Yeah, because during the recent times that we're going through, I thought we had a family actually call to check on one of our detectives to see how they was faring and making it through everything.
Yes, we did. We had a homicide victim's family that called, and they were concerned during all the protests, and they were actually concerned for the detective that was working their son's case.
Wow, 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 wow. Well, homicides is one of those crimes that we just cannot prevent. Different reasons create homicides. Can you talk about some of the different motives behind these things? Because I mean, they're all over the place as far as why did it take place.
Well, most homicides are crimes of passion, or in Wilmington, sometimes we have crimes of inter-gang rivalry. And some of the gang rivalry could be over business. The gangs that are operating are usually in business of selling narcotics, and you could have territorial disputes over who's going to sell here or there, or you could have inter-gang disputes between them, and it's about who's the bigger, badder entity. And sometimes they'll send out junior members of their gangs to send a message to the other gang that they're the badder gang. And sometimes homicides can be just that silly. But other times homicides, in the United States, a bulk of the homicides are usually domestic related. And we do see domestic homicides here in Wilmington, quite a few. And domestic homicides, between partners, domestic partners, husbands and wives, or any type of domestic partners is, unfortunately all too common. And at a police department, you try to do your best to prevent crime. We have all kind of units. Here at the Wilmington Police Department, our mobile field force team, and our gang unit, our current involvement in the gun violence reduction initiative in Wilmington that you started, all those things are aimed at trying to prevent these crimes, and we may be able to prevent some crimes. It's unknown how many we prevent, because if we're preventing them, they're not happening. But as far as the domestic violence homicide, I can't prevent a husband and wife from having an argument inside their own home. I can't prevent the loss of the job that led to the financial difficulties that led to the argument, which infuriated somebody's senses. I can't keep a husband or a wife from having infidelity issues on their spouses that led to a crime of passion. Those crimes are always going to occur, and they are always going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to prevent. And in that aspect, the homicide detectives come in afterwards and try to paint the picture of what happened and bring the offender to justice.
All right, let me ask you this one, Tom. I know sometimes our detectives will get the call. They may be out there for 2 days straight working on it. As long as we're feeding them, they're going to keep going at it. What do you think the average amount of man-hours are that we put into each homicide investigation, and how many detectives that you think we would have assigned to it working around the clock for a day or two?
Well, Sergeant Irving's team is currently comprised of 5 detectives that work the robbery and homicide unit. And typically on a homicide, he'll call in his whole team, because usually there's a lot of investigative tasks that need to be accomplished. Whether that's interviewing witnesses, or attending autopsies at the medical examiner's office, or trying to collect additional forensic evidence, or writing search warrants on vehicles or houses that are also have been brought to light during the investigation. It's important to have this whole team there. It's not unusual for them to go without sleep or rest or break for sometimes up to 48 hours, and I've seen it actually go longer than that. So, 5 detectives working 48 hours, I don't have a calculator on me right now, but that's, pretty extensive, and that's not including Sergeant Irving or Lieutenant Masacchio or myself or you or the patrol or the Sting Center. So each homicide investigation, involves thousands and thousands of investigative hours by the mobile field force that's out there, the U.S. Marshals Task Force going to apprehend these fugitives, which we've had multiple apprehensions in the last few weeks. Our detective that works with the U.S. Marshals Task Force has been extremely busy. Those hours count for the investigation. The actual homicide investigators themselves, the employees in the Sting Center, that big team at the Wilmington Police Department that's coming together to bring this case to fruition. Thousands and thousands of hours dedicated to this. The homicide members themselves, to watch their dedication sometimes, I mean, sometimes I have to come in, or Lieutenant Masacchio has to come in and tell them, go home, because they become ineffective because they're so tired. And usually, you know, we start getting into 24 or 36 hours, I'm starting to look at the team kind of like, I think y'all need to go home and get some rest and come back here with a fresh mind and let's look at this. Or I think y'all are becoming ineffective due to the lack of sleep. But that's the level of dedication that they have, to sacrifice their time away from their families and their friends and their loved ones, to come in here and try to bring justice for these families that have lost their loved ones. To me, that's highly admirable, and we still have great employees at this police department that are dedicating themselves to that task.
They are. When we have a homicide taking place, I've seen them in multiple directions. I've seen some at the scene. You may have some securing search warrants. You'll have others inventorying a car, and the next day you'll have one group go off to an autopsy. You'll have another group out looking to pull surveillance footage. It's just mind-boggling to me what these young men and women do. And they do it, they do not complain, because they know it's in the best interest of our community and in the best interest of justice in their family.
Yes.
Their family. You just can't say enough. I'm very proud of them as a police chief, and I say this a lot. If you leave our detectives a little crumb, they're gonna solve that case. They're gonna solve it if they can.
That's all it takes, you know, and I guess, you know, we didn't talk about a lot of the evidence that it takes to solve a homicide. I know a lot of people are curious about that. One of the things that I wanted to say is that the most important piece of evidence that we can bring to a jury is witness testimony. Witness testimony is vital to winning a case. We can gather all the forensic evidence and have ballistics and laser, you know, designated areas. We can pinpoint trajectories of bullets and all kinds of crazy stuff that we have the capabilities to do here at the Wilmington Police Department. But the bottom line is, a juror wants to hear human testimony about what happened. I can paint the picture with them from forensics, but it's even better when we have a witness get up there and say, this is what happened. And not only that, that when the witness says what happens, it also corroborates the forensic evidence that we've collected. So witness testimony is the most valuable piece of evidence that we will ever need to gather in an investigation.
I wholeheartedly agree. On a final question that I have for you, after we make the arrest, we do the press release, or in some cases we'll do a press conference. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and there's a time limit that we have to get that work done once we make that arrest. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the detectives basically have 72 hours after they make the arrest to turn over the entirety of our case to that point to the district attorney's office. So, you know, the time limits keep popping. So it's not just the first 48 and gathering the stuff. Once we make the arrest, we have 72 hours to turn over discovery in that case to the district attorney's office. And there's a lot of work that has to happen. But even after that discovery is turned in, there's still work that's going on. There's forensic evidence follow-up that we have to do on items of evidence that we've turned in. There's detectives have to drive evidence to the state lab in Garner, North Carolina, and they have to go back and retrieve that evidence once it's been analyzed at the state lab in Garner. And then they have to take those evidence analysis reports and interpret them. Because usually the analysis reports don't really have any conclusions in them, except for the scientific, what they say scientifically, and then we have to figure out how those lab reports correlate with the facts in our case. And then we have to do the synopsis of those and other police reports and get those additional evidence follow-ups that happen at the police department to the district attorney's office so that they can prepare for the prosecution of the case.
Wow, a lot of work.
It's insane the amount of work that goes on, and usually it's unseen. You know, the work the detectives do, and it's not just the robbery homicide detectives, it's all of our detectives, is you know, mostly unseen, unheralded, and but it's certainly a valuable asset to our police department.
Yes. Well, Tom, you're an asset to this police department. You're an asset to this community, and you've been for over 20 years. And I appreciate everything that you do, your detectives are doing, and all the men and women of the Wilmington Police Department. This is a team effort, 300 and some plus employees strong. And if you're interested in becoming a Wilmington police officer or a civilian, because if you noticed earlier, Tom touched on civilian non-sworn positions. We have crime scene investigators, we have front desk personnel, we have administrative staff. We are looking to hire. Just go to our city's website at wilmingtonnc.gov and look for employment opportunities. Thank you for enjoying our first episode, hopefully of Behind the Badge and sitting at the blue table. I enjoyed this. I get to wear the blue shirt also on any episodes that we do. So if you have future ideas about things that you want to know about that's going on in the Wilmington Police Department, we want to share it with you if it's something that we can share. So email those ideas to officeofthechief@wilmingtonnc.gov. And we'll be glad to take those ideas and build future episodes. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from those ideas you may have for us.